"Can you stay until I fall asleep?" she asked. And the cowboy didn't know he already loved her. Wind tore down the narrow trail as if trying to erase it, pushing grit and dry leaves across the path in swirling patterns that made the world feel smaller by the minute. And the young woman fought to keep her footing as she hurried toward the dim glow of a lantern swinging outside the supply shed. She hadn't meant to be out this late. She hadn't meant to wander far from camp. She certainly hadn't meant to reach the point where her hands shook from exhaustion as much as cold. But the sky had darkened faster than she expected, the air turning sharp, and the weight of everything she had been carrying all week pressed harder with each step until her legs simply couldn't match her will anymore, and she sank to the ground beside the fence rail with her breath hitching in tight, uneven bursts that startled her more than the wind. She tried to steady herself, pressing her palms against the frozen dirt. But a flicker of movement caught her eye, the soft crunch of boots on gravel, and she tensed until she recognized the tall cowboy coming up the trail, coat slung over one shoulder, hat pulled low against the wind, his posture calm, in the way of men who spent their lives in wide spaces where panic never helped anyone. He stopped when he saw her on the ground, not rushing toward her, not calling out, just letting his eyes take in her condition the way seasoned riders read weather. And after a moment he stepped closer and knelt to her level with a steadiness that felt more like shelter than concern. She tried to sit straighter, tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat, and what finally escaped was nothing she had meant to say at all, only a thin, trembling whisper carried by the wind. "Can you stay until I fall asleep?" For a moment he didn't answer, his brows tightening slightly as if weighing her exhaustion, her shaking hands, the long week she'd spent pushing herself harder than anyone should have, and he rested one hand on the fence rail beside her instead of touching her directly, giving her space while still anchoring the moment. She looked down, embarrassed by her own question, but he didn't dismiss her, didn't tease, didn't make her feel smaller for asking something born from fear and fatigue rather than weakness. He only shifted his coat forward so it sheltered her from the wind and said quietly, "You don't have to get through the night alone." That was all. No promise, no emotion layered underneath. Just a statement from a man who had seen too many people break themselves trying to hold on when rest would have saved them. She let her shoulders drop a fraction, the first release she'd allowed in days, and the sound of the wind softened around them as if the world itself recognized the small, fragile moment of safety she'd finally stepped into. The cowboy didn't move closer, didn't try to lift her, didn't rush her to stand. He simply settled beside the rail, staying near enough that she could breathe without fear, and the quiet pressed around them like a blanket wrapped by the night. And though sleep didn't take her yet, for the first time in a long while, she believed it might come without a fight. She woke to the faint creak of wood as the cowboy shifted his weight on the fence rail, the night settling into a cooler, quieter stillness that felt less like danger and more like a tired world finally catching its breath. And for the first time she realized she must have slept. Only a brief drift, a handful of minutes, but still sleep, because the sky above them had darkened from deep blue to the thick charcoal of true night. The wind had calmed. The lantern near the shed flickered with a steadier flame, and the trembling in her hands had eased enough that she could sit up without her breath breaking, though the exhaustion still clung to her like a heavy coat she couldn't shrug off. The cowboy noticed the change immediately. He didn't speak right away, didn't offer questions she wasn't ready to answer. Only scooped a handful of dirt beside his boot and let it slip through his fingers as he watched the road they'd come from, scanning it with the quiet, layered awareness of a man who'd spent years reading silence for signs of trouble. When she finally found her voice, it came out small but steadier than before. just enough to thank him for staying. And he shook his head once, slow, as if the gratitude wasn't something he knew where to place. She studied his face then, the sharp lines softened by lantern light, and realized she didn't even know his name. It felt wrong to keep calling him the Cowboy in her mind, when he had given her something far more precious than formality, a calm she hadn't felt in months, and the sense, however brief, that she wasn't fighting this frontier alone. So she asked, not boldly, not shyly, just truthfully, "What do I call you?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the dark hills, then to the frost forming on the fence rail, and only after a long breath did he reply in a tone that suggested he rarely bothered introducing himself at all. "Reese," he said, the name shaped simply, without flourish or expectation, as if it were just another tool he carried, useful when needed, forgotten when not. She repeated it under her breath, not to claim it, not to make the moment anything it wasn't, but because speaking it made her feel more anchored to the ground beneath her boots, instead of the endless exhaustion that had followed her from town to town. He seemed to read the thought behind her repetition, because he nodded once, accepting the small connection without turning it into something heavier than it was. Reese shifted then, adjusting his coat so it blocked the chill still leaking through the gaps in the fence, and asked, not demanding, not pressing, whether she could stand. She tried, bracing her hand against the rail, but her legs wobbled under her weight, and she sank back down with a frustrated breath. Reese didn't scold or hurry her. He only set his hat a little lower against the cold and said quietly, "No need to rush. We move when you're ready." And in that moment, with the night stretched wide around them and her strength slowly returning, she realized that knowing his name didn't make her feel smaller or indebted. It made her feel steadier, as if the world had finally given her one thing that wouldn't disappear when she closed her eyes again. The night deepened into that quiet, unmoving darkness the frontier knew well, the kind where even the wind paused between breaths, and Reese shifted only enough to ease the weight on his boots as she leaned back against the fence rail, gathering whatever strength she'd regained since waking. He didn't ask her anything, didn't press for the story behind her exhaustion, didn't even look at her directly, just kept his eyes on the trail, on the flicker of lantern light, on the distant outlines of the hills she'd crossed in a way that suggested he understood more from silence than most men learned from conversation. She wanted to thank him again, wanted to apologize again, wanted to explain why sleep had become something she feared instead of something she trusted, but the words tangled behind her ribs, refusing to form without cracking open things she'd held tightly shut for months. Reese must have sensed the struggle because he let the quiet sit between them without breaking it, resting his hands loosely on his knees as though giving her space was as natural to him as breathing. A long moment passed, calm, steady, almost still, and in that space she found the courage to look at him fully, noticing the faint dusting of trail dirt on his coat, the rough stitching at the shoulder seam, the small tear near his elbow where a branch must have snagged it earlier in the week. He was the kind of man the land shaped through harsh seasons and harder lessons, yet he sat beside her now with a patience that didn't match the ruggedness of his frame. She closed her eyes briefly, drawing in a breath that steadied instead of shaking. And when she opened them again, Reese's gaze had drifted toward her, not prying, not questioning, only checking whether she was fading or holding on. The sincerity of that small glance, quiet, steady, unforced, broke something loose inside her chest, and before fear could clamp down again, she whispered the thing she hadn't said aloud in longer than she cared to remember. "My name is Mara." She said it softly, almost cautiously, as if testing whether the world would punish her for claiming it again, and for a heartbeat she regretted letting it slip, But Rhys didn't shift or stiffen or react with surprise. He only nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the name as if it were the most natural truth to surface in the night. He didn't repeat it. He didn't praise it. He simply accepted it. The way men of the mountains accept dawn when it finally arrives. Quietly, with respect for whatever struggle brought it there. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It wasn't embarrassed. It wasn't searching for more. It was a silence that understood names were not decorations. They were burdens carried, histories survived, proof a person still existed even when the world had worn them down to exhaustion. Mara breathed easier after that, letting her shoulders rest against the fence rail as Rhys leaned back as well, both of them facing the open dark without words, without questions, without anything except the shared understanding that sometimes the hardest thing in the world is saying your own name out loud. And in the stillness that settled after, Mara felt, not safer, not whole, but present, as if she had stepped back into herself for the first time in a long while. Dawn hadn't yet touched the sky, but the darkness had shifted, the kind of subtle thinning that mountain folks recognized even with their backs turned, and Mara felt it in her bones before she saw it, a loosening of the cold edge in the air, as if the world itself was preparing to breathe again. Rhys stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders, then offered her a quiet gesture toward the shed, where the lantern still hung, its light fading but steady enough to guide her steps if she could walk. She rose with care, bracing herself on the fence rail, determined not to lean on him unless her legs truly failed. And though they trembled under her weight, they held. Rhys stayed a half step away, not touching, not crowding, simply matching her pace so she wouldn't feel she was facing the dark alone. The short walk to the shed felt longer than it should have. Exhaustion left her breath thin, her thoughts scattered, and every few steps her mind tugged back toward the things she'd been trying not to think about for days. The voices, the judgment, the way people stared at her when she faltered under responsibilities no one else bothered to see. Rhys didn't ask what was wrong, but Mara sensed he already knew that tiredness wasn't what had driven her outside tonight. When they reached the shed, he pushed the door open gently, letting her step inside first where the air was warmer and the wind could no longer scrape at her nerves. The room smelled of dried hay and old wood, a comforting mix for anyone raised near stockyards or shallow barns, and Mara felt her chest loosen as she sank onto a bench beside the work table. Rhys leaned against the wall opposite her, crossing his arms lightly, watching without staring. He didn't rush her into speaking, but the quiet offered no escape route either. It held her there, steady and patient, until the truth fighting inside her finally pressed past the barrier she'd built around it. "I haven't slept in 3 nights," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. The admission surprised her with how raw it sounded, how heavy. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear them. The same words, over and over." Rhys didn't interrupt. He didn't nod or frown or soften. He simply waited. Mara gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles whitening. "They said I couldn't keep up, that I slowed everyone down, that someone like me had no place on a winter drive." Her breath hitched, and she looked away. Ashamed of how much it hurt to repeat what others had thrown at her so carelessly, Rhys's voice came low, even, shaped with the certainty of a man who'd lived through his share of harsh judgments. "Hard trails never start with people who believe in you." He let the words sit, not as comfort, but as truth, a truth she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. Mara swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I just needed one night where I didn't feel like I was failing." Rhys shifted his stance slightly, the movement small but intentional. "Then tonight's that night." He didn't say more, didn't push, didn't offer promises the world had no reason to keep. But the way he stood there, calm, unshaken, giving her space to breathe without demanding anything in return, felt stronger than any reassurance she'd been offered in months. And for the first time, Mara wondered if this moment, this quiet, unexpected shelter in the shed, might be the first step toward finding her strength again. The shed's wooden walls muffled the wind, letting the silence settle in a way that felt almost protective, and Mara's shoulders sagged under the slow release of tension she'd been carrying so tightly it had become a second spine. Her breath trembled from the exhaustion of confessing truths she'd spent days avoiding, and Rhys noticed it immediately, his posture shifting with the instinct of someone who'd learned to read strain long before words ever reached his ears. Without comment, he stepped toward the work table, pulling a small tin kettle from a shelf and filling it with water from the barrel tucked near the wall. The sound of water pouring was soft but grounding, a steady rhythm in the quiet, as he set the kettle atop the small iron stove used by riders when colder months demanded warm hands and warmer air. Mara watched with a mix of embarrassment and relief, unsure how to hold herself when someone offered help without strings, without questions, without assuming weakness. She wrapped her arms lightly around her chest, not to guard herself, but to keep from shaking as Rhys checked the stove's coals and added a thin piece of kindling to wake the heat. Minutes passed in gentle stillness until the kettle began to hiss its readiness, and Rhys poured the steaming water into a tin cup, swirling it lightly before carrying it to her with both hands in a way that made it clear he wasn't rushing her or expecting anything from her response. She accepted the cup with trembling fingers, the warmth radiating into her palms like a small promise, and breathed slowly until her heartbeat steadied. Rhys crouched beside the bench, then, not close, not touching, but near enough that she could see the seriousness in his expression as he soaked a clean cloth in the remaining hot water. He wrung it out carefully and offered it to her first, letting her decide whether she wanted help. But when she struggled to lift her arm high enough to press the cloth to her face, he reached for her hand with a pause that gave her every chance to pull back. She didn't. And so he tended to her exhaustion the same way he'd tended to injured colts and frostbitten riders over the years. Slowly, methodically, with a gentleness earned through storms rather than softness, lifting the cloth to her forehead, her temples, the back of her neck, letting warmth seep into muscles clenched from too many sleepless nights. She closed her eyes, not out of trust but out of sheer relief, and Rhys worked in silence. Each movement deliberate so she would never mistake care for intrusion. When he finally stepped back, the room felt warmer, steadier, as if the care itself had changed the air. Mara lowered the cup from her lips, breathing easier, her shaking reduced to a faint tremor. "Thank you," she managed, the words small but honest. Rhys stood, returning the kettle to the shelf. "You needed rest," he said simply, as if that was all the explanation necessary. No lecture, no judgment, just truth spoken with the quiet certainty of a man who knew that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was accept help, when the world had convinced them they didn't deserve it. Mara felt the weight inside her shift. Not gone, not solved, but lighter, and she realized this night was giving her something she hadn't had in longer than she admitted to herself. A place to breathe without fear of being told she wasn't enough. The stove's warmth climbed steadily through the shed, pushing back the last traces of the cold outside, and Mara felt her breathing settle into a rhythm that didn't shake or stutter, a small miracle after so many nights spent fighting sleep, as if rest itself were a threat. Rhys didn't move far, only stepped to the opposite side of the shed, where tools hung neatly on pegs, resting one hand lightly on the wall, as if grounding the space for both of them. He didn't speak. He didn't ask how she felt, or whether the fear still clawed at her from the corners of her mind. Instead, he let the quiet fill the room in a way that didn't press or demand. A silence shaped by a lifetime of knowing that words could crowd a person when what they needed most was room to breathe. Mara shifted on the bench, letting her back rest fully against the wall. Her hands cupped together in her lap, as though preparing herself for something she couldn't yet name. Rhys watched the stove for a long moment, ensuring the flame stayed steady, then turned his gaze toward the small window near the ceiling, where a few thin beams of moonlight pierced the boards. He reached up and adjusted the cloth pinned over the frame, blocking the draft before it could snake back into the room. The motion small but unmistakably thoughtful. Mara followed the gesture with her eyes, her throat tightening at the simplicity of it. Care offered without expectation, without the noise of reassurances or the false comfort of pretending everything would be easy come morning. When Rhys lowered his arm, he glanced her way, not fully facing her but checking in the quiet way men like him learned to check. A steady look, brief but thorough, making sure she was present, upright, holding together. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She only held his gaze for a heartbeat longer than before, and something unspoken passed between them. Acknowledgement, gratitude, the fragile truth that sometimes honesty lived better in silence than in trembling words. Rhys returned to his place by the wall, lowering himself to sit on the ground with his back straight, boots planted in the straw-covered floor, settling in as if the night demanded endurance rather than comfort. Mara watched him for several breaths, noting the way he rested one forearm on his knee, the way his shoulders stayed relaxed but alert, the way he positioned himself so she could see him clearly without feeling watched. It was a posture made for keeping someone safe without announcing it. After a while, the shed's quiet grew almost warm, the kind of quiet that didn't erase fear but softened its claws, teaching the body that danger didn't own every moment. Mara exhaled slowly, letting her eyes drift shut, not collapsing, not surrendering, just allowing herself a small piece of rest she hadn't trusted in far too long. Rhys didn't shift, didn't speak, didn't mark the moment with anything more than patience. And in the wordless stillness of that shed, Mara understood that this silence, steady, unwavering, without judgment, was the closest thing she had felt to safety in months, a space where the night no longer pressed her to break. The shed had settled into a calm so deep that Mara almost believed the world outside had gone quiet with it. But Rhys hadn't fully relaxed, his posture steady, his eyes lifted now and then to the window near the ceiling, measuring the shifting moonlight like a gauge for time and trouble. She drifted close to sleep once or twice, catching herself before slipping under. But exhaustion pressed harder with each breath, and finally she let her eyes close fully, trusting, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the night didn't have sharp teeth waiting for her. Rhys noticed the shift in her breathing and stood slowly, stretching his legs without making a sound, stepping closer to the door to check the latch out of habit more than fear. But habit saved many lives in the West, and it saved another now. Because as he leaned toward the plank securing the door, a faint crunch of gravel outside snapped his attention sharp. It was not wind, not settling boards, not a drifting animal. It was footsteps, a single pair, moving slow, deliberate, coming up the path that led directly to the shed. Rhys's jaw tightened, and he moved without noise to pinch out the lantern flame on the wall, plunging the room into a softer darkness, broken only by the slow pulse of the stove's embers. Mara stirred, half waking, and Rhys rested a hand near her shoulder. Not touching, but close enough for her to sense stillness was necessary. Her eyes snapped open at the tone of the night, some instinct deep in her bones recognizing danger even before reason caught up. She sat rigid, breath trapped in her throat as she looked to Rhys for explanation. But he shook his head once, a calm signal that said, "Wait, listen, don't fear, unless I fear." They both held still. The footsteps came closer, slow and crunching over the frost-hardened ground, stopping just outside the shed door as if the unknown figure were listening, testing the air for voices or movement. Mara's heart hammered so loudly she feared it might give them away, but Rhys's presence steadied her. He stepped between her and the door with a subtle, practiced shift of his frame, his silhouette becoming a quiet barrier in the dimness. A shadow passed across the narrow crack beneath the door. Then a hand pressed lightly against the outer plank, testing the latch, feeling the resistance of Rhys's earlier check. Whoever it was did not knock, did not call out, only pressed once more, harder, before withdrawing their hand in silence. Mara felt a tremor climb her spine, every muscle ready to break into panic, but Rhys remained perfectly still, tracking the figure's movements by sound alone. After several long breaths, the footsteps retreated, faintly at first, then more clearly, moving away from the shed and down the trail toward the direction Mara had come from earlier. Only when the night fully swallowed the sound did Rhys allow the room to breathe again. Mara swallowed hard. "Rhys," she whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't answer directly. He only checked the latch one more time, then said quietly, "Someone knew you were out here." It wasn't accusation, it wasn't fear, it was truth. And that truth hung heavier than the darkness itself. Morning crept toward the horizon with a pale, washed-out light that didn't warm the ground so much as reveal what the night had been hiding. And Rhys decided they couldn't stay in the shed. Not with someone prowling so close. Not with Mara's fear trembling just beneath her steady breaths. He opened the door only a crack, studying the trail, the tree line, the ridge beyond the old corral, every angle of the landscape shifting under the soft gray of dawn until he was certain the footsteps from the night were gone. For now, Mara followed him out, her steps careful, her eyes moving constantly as if expecting danger to rise from the frost itself. But Rhys stayed beside her, matching her pace with that quiet protectiveness he carried like second nature. They headed toward camp, the path widening as the outbuildings came into view. Their shapes outlined in the hard morning light. A few ranch hands stirred near the cook fire. Someone hammered a loose board on the barn, and voices carried faintly through the cold air. Ordinary sounds, familiar ones. But Rhys's tension didn't ease, not even a little. He kept looking toward the road, the one Mara had walked down last night, and she felt the shift in him before she saw what had drawn his focus. A rider sat waiting where the trail opened into the yard, a broad man on a chestnut gelding, coat dark, hat low, posture rigid in the saddle like someone who had spent the entire night chasing a thought he couldn't let go. His horse stamped the frozen dirt, impatient, but the rider didn't move. He looked only at Mara. She stopped cold. Rhys stepped half a pace in front of her. Subtle, natural, but unmistakable, his body forming a quiet line between her and the stranger on the horse. The camp's morning noise faded as hands paused their work, eyes drifting toward the tension coiling at the edge of the yard. The rider pushed his hat back enough that Mara could see his face, sharp jaw, narrowed eyes, a familiarity that made her stomach twist. "You left without a word," he said, voice flat, carrying across the cold air with a practiced authority that made Mara's breath hitch. Rhys didn't answer. He didn't move aside. He didn't acknowledge the stranger at all, only stood there, steady as the post holding up the corral gate. The rider's gaze flicked to Rhys, irritation tightening his grip on the reins. This ain't your concern, Cowboy. Reese still didn't respond. Silence stretched. Not empty silence, but the kind that made a man realize he'd misjudged the ground he was standing on. The rider shifted in the saddle, scanning the faces watching from the yard, then pointed at Mara. She belongs back with the group. She slows the trail, He stopped when Reese finally lifted his head, meeting the man's stare with a focus that stripped every ounce of bluster from the morning. Reese spoke only one sentence, low enough that Mara barely heard it. She's not going anywhere she doesn't choose to. The words rolled out with the weight of a boundary drawn in stone, and the yard fell quiet around them. The rider opened his mouth to argue, but something in Reese's stare, calm, unwavering, carved from a kind of resolve the frontier respected, forced him to swallow the rest. After a long moment, he clicked his tongue, turned his horse, and rode off toward the ridge without another word. Only when he disappeared into the gray morning did Mara feel her body release the breath it had been holding like a wound. Reese didn't look back at her. He just scanned the road once more, making sure the danger truly retreated. And the camp, having witnessed the quiet line he drew, understood something that morning. Reese wasn't a man who raised his voice. He was a man who stood his ground. The camp did not return to its usual rhythm right away. Even after the rider vanished beyond the ridge, people lingered near the cook fire, tools forgotten in their hands, glancing toward Mara with a mixture of curiosity, concern, and that dawning respect that only appears after witnessing a truth no one expected to see. Mara kept her eyes low as Reese guided her toward the warmth of the fire. But every step felt heavier, as if the whole ranch were tilting beneath her feet, and she wasn't sure whether the tremor in her chest came from fear of the man who had confronted her, or the shock of someone, anyone, choosing to stand before her rather than behind her. Reese didn't speak. He simply pulled a stool forward, set it beside the flames, and motioned for her to sit, then crouched to check the small tear in her sleeve from the night before. His hands moving with the same silent focus he'd used when he stepped between her and the rider. A ranch hand named Porter approached first, clearing his throat like he was walking into a church. "Wasn't my place to stare," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "But just so you know, no one here thinks that fella had the right to talk to you that way." Mara blinked, startled by the unexpected support. Before she could answer, Agnes from the kitchen ambled over with a steaming tin cup. "You look half frozen, sweetheart," she said, pressing it gently into Mara's hands. "Warm yourself up. And if that man comes back, he'll answer to more than just Reese." A few other ranch workers gathered nearby, pretending to be busy while staying close enough to listen. Not gawking. Listening. Mara felt her throat tighten in a way she didn't understand because no one had ever paused their work for her, much less offered anything more than a passing glance. Reese stayed quiet beside her, arms resting loosely on his knees, gaze fixed on the trail, as if expecting trouble to roll back like a storm, not finished with its business. Someone finally asked the question hanging over everyone's head. "Miss, were you hurt on that trail crew?" The words were soft, careful, nothing like the interrogation she'd been bracing for. Mara swallowed. Her voice came out thin but steady enough. "I wasn't fast enough," she said. "Not strong enough. They said I slowed them down." A murmur of disapproval passed through the small crowd, low but unmistakable. Reese lifted his head then, not to speak but to give the group a single look, one that made them understand this story was hers to tell or hers to keep. The silence that followed wasn't pity. It was permission. Porter shook his head slowly. "A trail crew that leaves someone behind ain't worth following. And any man who comes to claim you like your gear that got dropped isn't worth listening to." Agnes nodded sharply in agreement. You don't owe him a return, child. Not after the way you walked in last night. Mara looked up. How did I walk in? Agnes gave a small smile that didn't reach humor, but carried something sturdier. Like someone who'd carried more fear than most folks see in a lifetime, and still kept moving. A warmth she couldn't place spread through Mara's chest. Not safety, not joy, but something quieter and deeper. Being seen. Rhys finally stood, stretching his back with a crack of his shoulders, and faced the small gathering. She stays here until she decides otherwise. No one argued. Not one voice rose in doubt. The camp, by unspoken agreement, accepted it as truth. And as Mara watched the men and women drift back to their work with a new kind of glance in her direction, not dismissive, not curious, but acknowledging, she realized something she had never believed could be true. Sometimes a place didn't wait for you to earn belonging. Sometimes it simply made room. Dawn rose slowly, carrying the soft gold that slips over the prairie like a quiet apology for every hard night that came before, and Mara woke on the cot Rhys had set up in the bunkhouse corner, the blanket tucked so neatly around her that she knew he'd checked on her more than once through the night, even if he'd never admitted aloud. She shifted carefully, feeling the ache of days spent walking with no destination, and the heaviness of fear that had finally begun to loosen its hold. And when she stepped outside, the morning air met her with a kind of gentle clarity she hadn't felt in years. Rhys was already up, leaning against the corral fence as he poured grain into a wooden trough for his mare. And though he didn't turn when she approached, the small lift of his hand told her he'd sensed her there, from the moment the door opened. He didn't ask how she'd slept, didn't push her to talk, didn't act like a man waiting for gratitude or explanation. He simply stepped aside so she could stand beside him, letting the quiet speak first. The camp was waking slowly. Agnes lighting the stove in the kitchen, Porter repairing a fence rail, 2 ranch hands arguing over whose turn it was to fetch water. But the glances Mara received today were different, warmer, anchored in something born from yesterday's confrontation. No one questioned her place. No one looked at her like a burden someone had forgotten to drag away. Rhys finally spoke, his voice low enough that it didn't travel beyond the corral. "You've got choices now," he said. "You can stay here a while, long as you need. Or Agnes knows folks who can help you find work in town if that's what you want." Mara watched the mare nudge Rhys's shoulder, gentle as a whisper, and she felt a steadiness grow inside her that hadn't existed before. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted. I don't want to be afraid when I walk." Rhys nodded once, the simple kind of agreement that held more weight than most men's speeches. "Then today you walk here," he said. "No one's going to chase you. No one's going to claim you. You set your pace." A small breath caught in her throat. Not fear, not sorrow, but something like the first step of healing. And she glanced around the yard that had, in a single morning, shifted from stranger's land to a place that might one day feel like her own. Porter approached with a canteen and a sheepish grin. "Rhys says you'll be helping Agnes in the kitchen today if you're up for it," he said. "Don't worry, she only yells when someone burns the biscuits." Mara managed the faintest smile, surprising herself with how natural it felt. "I can try," she said. Rhys gave a brief nod of approval, then turned back to his mare as if the moment didn't need any grand conclusion. Only truth. Mara stepped toward the cookhouse, each footfall steadier than the last, and when she reached the doorway, she looked back once, seeing Rhys still at the fence, a constant figure in a world that had spun too fast for too long. He didn't wave, didn't speak, didn't even look immediately. But she knew, with a certainty that settled her breath, that if fear ever rose again, he would be the first to sense it. And as the sun reached across the yard like a gentle hand, warming the cold earth she had crossed alone for so many miles, Mara felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. The beginning of rest, earned not through escape, but through being believed. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to Echoes of the West. Tell me this. If you saw someone standing alone and afraid on the prairie, would you step forward or wait for someone else to move first?